History often remembers rulers for their actions, the conquests they achieved, the empires they built, or the terror they inflicted, but rarely do we pause to examine the foundations that made such figures possible. The roots of ruthlessness, it turns out, are rarely spontaneous. They are carefully cultivated across generations, embedded in the bloodlines of families that learned early on that survival required cunning, cruelty, and an unrelenting drive for power. To understand the most notorious rulers of history, we must travel backward through time, tracing the origins of the dynasties that produced them, unearthing the social, familial, and even biological conditions that shaped their early development. The story begins in the earliest civilizations, where power was both fragile and absolute. In ancient Assyria, kingship was not merely a position but a hereditary covenant, often secured through brutal elimination of rivals, even within one's own family. Children were trained to observe, imitate, and eventually embody the behaviors of their predecessors. The palace was more than a residence, it was a crucible where ambition and cruelty were forged side by side. Every whispered instruction, every witnessed act of punishment, became a lesson in how to wield authority without hesitation. It was a pattern repeated in the royal courts of Mesopotamia, where dynastic continuity was paramount, and mercy was a luxury afforded only to the politically expedient. The same principle can be observed in the annals of Rome, where bloodlines and social pedigree determined the trajectory of future emperors. The lives of young patricians were tightly controlled, their education meticulously designed to instill mastery over rhetoric, law, and strategy, but also to cultivate an acute awareness of human weakness and the utility of fear. Even then, historical records hint at the darker lessons: whispered threats, manipulated rivalries, and the strategic use of cruelty as a means of asserting dominance. Rome's bloodlines were more than genealogical records, they were blueprints for ambition, maps that guided heirs through a world where one misstep could mean exile, execution, or public humiliation. Far to the east, dynasties in China similarly embedded ruthlessness into the very fabric of inheritance. The children of emperors and powerful warlords were often subject to rigorous mental and physical training, instilled with lessons drawn from both philosophy and pragmatism. Confucian ideals of filial duty blended with the harsh realities of court intrigue, creating a duality that required rulers to embody moral virtue publicly while exercising iron discipline privately. The careful cultivation of loyalty, suspicion, and control within the family prepared these heirs for the ultimate responsibility: maintaining absolute power in an environment where betrayal could emerge from even the closest kin. Yet these dynastic origins were not merely a matter of geography or culture, they were deeply personal. Families who survived repeated cycles of war, famine, and political upheaval often developed unspoken codes of behavior, passing them quietly from one generation to the next. Obedience, cunning, and an instinct for survival were treated as heirlooms, as vital as lands or titles. The very act of bearing a particular surname or occupying a certain lineage came with an implicit instruction: endure, manipulate, dominate, or perish. This invisible education, conducted in shadows and whispered lessons, ensured that each new generation would inherit not only wealth and status but also the psychological armor necessary to thrive in environments defined by danger and intrigue. Historical records, however, often obscure these truths. Public narratives celebrated heroism, conquests, or wise governance, conveniently glossing over the subtle inheritance of ruthlessness that occurred behind palace doors. Rare documents, letters, memoirs, and the occasional diary entry reveal a far more complex reality. They depict households where children were taught to anticipate threats, where a lesson in loyalty could quickly turn into a lesson in fear, and where the future ruler learned to navigate a labyrinth of both familial affection and political expediency. These seemingly minor moments, trivial at first glance, became the hidden scaffolding for later acts of extreme power and brutality. Even the most notorious rulers were, in a sense, products of their ancestry. The patterns established by early generations did not guarantee cruelty, but they created conditions in which it could flourish. The social conditioning, family expectations, and historical circumstances intersected in ways that made certain behaviors almost inevitable. In this light, the bloodline emerges not just as a matter of descent, but as a conduit of legacy, passing down strategies, behaviors, and attitudes that shaped the rulers who would leave an indelible mark on history. By tracing these origins, we begin to understand that the tyranny and ruthlessness of history's most infamous leaders did not emerge in isolation. They were born of preparation, observation, and the weight of inherited expectation. Each act of cruelty or cunning was not merely a personal choice but also a continuation of lessons, behaviors, and pressures inherited over generations. And as we explore the later stages of these dynasties, it becomes clear that the foundations laid in these early years, often invisible to the casual observer, were instrumental in shaping the public and private lives of rulers whose names still echo with fear and fascination today. As we trace the roots of ruthless dynasties, a compelling question emerges: are these rulers born cruel, or are they made? Did their ambition and capacity for brutality arise from some inherent biological predisposition, or were they meticulously shaped by the circumstances and expectations imposed upon them from birth? Historians, psychologists, and genealogists have wrestled with this question for decades, and the truth, unsurprisingly, lies somewhere in the uneasy intersection of nature and nurture. From the moment a future ruler enters the world, the weight of expectation presses heavily upon them. In aristocratic households across continents, infants were more than children, they were vessels of continuity, bearers of a lineage that demanded both survival and supremacy. In Europe during the Middle Ages, heirs to thrones or duchies were often separated from their parents at an early age to be raised under the strict supervision of tutors, advisors, or even distant relatives who acted as agents of the family's ambition. The lessons imparted were rarely gentle. A child would be taught to observe hierarchies, anticipate deception, and understand that mercy was a tool, not a virtue. Every game, every interaction, was a subtle rehearsal for the complex theater of power they would one day command. Yet the influence of biology cannot be dismissed. Modern research into genetics and psychology suggests that traits such as aggression, risk-taking, and strategic thinking can, to some degree, be inherited. Historical bloodlines often reveal striking patterns. Certain families repeatedly produced individuals capable of extraordinary ruthlessness, while others consistently favored diplomacy or prudence. These recurring traits hint at the possibility that the capacity for cruelty or ambition was, in some sense, embedded in the DNA of these dynasties. It is an unsettling thought, that the very blood coursing through the veins of a ruler might carry both the potential for greatness and the seeds of terror. But biology alone does not tell the whole story. Consider the young princes and princesses of the Ottoman Empire, where fratricide and palace intrigue were not anomalies but systemic strategies. Children born into this world were exposed early to the harsh realities of succession. Lessons in strategy, observation, and self-preservation were reinforced by fear and necessity. Even the most genetically predisposed child could falter without the immersive environment that demanded cunning and vigilance. Likewise, in the royal courts of France, the children of kings were often subjected to rigorous education in politics, religion, and diplomacy, coupled with exposure to the cruel consequences of failure. Ambition, in these contexts, was less a personal choice and more a survival imperative. The interplay between inherited traits and environmental shaping creates an almost cinematic duality: rulers who seemed destined for power because of their lineage, yet whose personalities were honed, sharpened, and sometimes twisted by circumstance. Diary entries, tutor reports, and rare letters offer glimpses into this hidden pedagogy. A child might write of envy toward siblings, admiration for cunning mentors, or fascination with punishment administered to servants. These small observations, when viewed collectively, reveal an education in the mechanics of fear and control, a training ground where cruelty became normalized, even admired. We also encounter the paradox of empathy, or its absence, within these bloodlines. Some heirs displayed remarkable intelligence and strategic acumen but were emotionally conditioned to suppress compassion in the name of survival or legacy. Others inherited impulsive aggression from their parents, magnified by the relentless pressures of their upbringing. The result was often a volatile mix of inherited temperament and socially reinforced behavior, a ruler whose cruelty could manifest as calculated policy, sudden violence, or both. It was a combination that made them not only effective in consolidating power but also unpredictable in their methods, a factor that cemented both fear and respect in equal measure. Yet these traits did not exist in isolation. The broader family network, mentors, and even rivals all contributed to the formation of a ruler's ambition. Strategic marriages, alliances, and clandestine lessons from advisors all served to amplify both inherited tendencies and environmental conditioning. What may appear as innate ruthlessness was often the product of countless subtle pressures working in concert. Every whisper, every subtle display of authority, every lesson in betrayal or loyalty, these were the invisible threads weaving the ruler's character, long before they ascended the throne. As historians and psychologists examine these patterns, a striking insight emerges: ambition and cruelty were rarely random acts. They were predictable outcomes of a carefully orchestrated blend of heredity and circumstance. The interplay of bloodline and upbringing created rulers who were at once natural and constructed, born into potential and molded into reality. And while some would rise to greatness with measured calculation, others would descend into terrifying excess, leaving legacies that still haunt the pages of history. Understanding this delicate balance between nature and nurture reshapes the way we view history. It forces us to reconsider the simplistic labels of evil or brilliant, revealing instead a complex dance between inherited predisposition and deliberate shaping. The cruelest acts were not merely personal failings or momentary lapses of morality, they were the culmination of generations of preparation, expectation, and opportunity. In this way, the bloodline itself becomes a silent architect of ambition, sculpting the minds and hearts of rulers before they ever claim the throne. And so, as we continue our exploration of hidden bloodlines, we begin to see a pattern emerging: cruelty and ambition are rarely spontaneous. They are cultivated, inherited, and reinforced, passed down through families who understood, often better than anyone else, that the survival of their line demanded more than loyalty or courage, it demanded ruthlessness. This realization sets the stage for the next chapter, where we will uncover how hidden alliances, secret marriages, and carefully arranged unions fortified these dynasties, ensuring that power, and the capacity for cruelty, remained concentrated within the right hands. While ambition and inherited traits laid the groundwork for ruthless rulers, bloodlines alone were not enough to secure lasting power. Throughout history, dynasties relied on a more subtle and often invisible tool: alliances forged in secrecy, marriages arranged in shadow, and connections that transcended borders and generations. These were not the grand, ceremonial unions celebrated in public annals, they were strategic maneuvers, carefully orchestrated to consolidate influence, neutralize rivals, and ensure the continuity of power. Behind every notorious ruler, there often lay a hidden network of relationships, unseen by the world but critical to shaping history itself. In medieval Europe, the intricate web of noble marriages was as much about survival as it was about legacy. Daughters and sons were rarely married for love, they were assets, bargaining chips in a high-stakes game of politics. A union could transform a struggling duchy into a regional powerhouse, or conversely, seal a family's downfall if miscalculated. But many of these alliances were deliberately kept out of the public eye, hidden from chroniclers, or recast in later histories to appear more romantic or noble. It was in this murky space that secret marriages emerged, alliances that historians are still uncovering, often through obscure letters, private contracts, and fragments of family records. These hidden unions not only reinforced political power but also strengthened the genetic continuity of ambition and, at times, cruelty within ruling families. The Ottomans offer another stark example. Princes and princesses were married with calculated precision, often to relatives within the wider dynasty or strategically positioned allies in distant provinces. The public narrative celebrated the dynasty's legitimacy, but behind closed doors, these marriages served as instruments of control. They reinforced loyalty, ensured that power remained within the hands of trusted relatives, and in some cases, created lines of succession designed to prevent rebellion. Rarely were these arrangements purely romantic, affection was secondary to strategy. Yet the personal consequences were profound. Children born from these unions inherited not only status but also the expectations, pressures, and psychological conditioning that had already shaped their parents. The hidden architecture of these marriages became a mechanism for sustaining ambition across generations. In East Asia, similar patterns emerged, though often entwined with philosophy and ritual. Royal and noble families in China and Korea frequently arranged marriages to align with powerful clans or to secure advantageous relations with influential officials. Beyond consolidating land or resources, these unions were intended to instill moral and political stability within the ruling class. But beneath the veneer of ceremony lay complex negotiations, secret promises, and sometimes covert betrayals. A marriage could cement loyalty, or, if mishandled, spark conflict, exile, or even assassination. The stakes were immense, and the lessons learned by young heirs observing these unions were clear. Power was inseparable from alliance, and trust was always conditional. What makes these secret marriages especially fascinating is the way they reinforced both the public and private dimensions of a ruler's life. On the surface, dynasties projected images of legitimacy, grace, and propriety. Behind closed doors, however, these relationships functioned as both safety nets and instruments of manipulation. Siblings, cousins, and distant relatives became allies, rivals, and pawns all at once. Children growing up in these environments learned early that familial bonds were strategic rather than sentimental. Every interaction, every gesture of loyalty, carried implicit lessons in negotiation, deception, and influence. In this sense, hidden alliances were not just political tools, they were formative experiences that shaped the very character of future rulers. Europe's Habsburgs provide perhaps the most dramatic example of the intersection between bloodline and hidden alliance. Through generations of meticulously arranged marriages, the dynasty expanded its reach across continents, ensuring that nearly every major throne in Europe was touched by its influence. Publicly, these unions were celebrated as demonstrations of diplomacy and grandeur. Privately, however, they were calculated measures to concentrate power, prevent rebellion, and cultivate a genetic continuity that sometimes carried both the benefits and dangers of inherited traits. Rare letters and family records reveal tensions, secret promises, and disputes that never reached the public eye, demonstrating the shadowy mechanics behind dynastic longevity. The consequences of these hidden alliances extended far beyond the walls of palaces. They shaped political landscapes, determined the outcomes of wars, and influenced succession crises that could destabilize entire regions. In some cases, they even produced rulers whose personal cruelty or ambition can be traced directly to the expectations embedded in these unions. Children raised within these hidden frameworks were not only heirs to power but also inheritors of a complex, often burdensome web of obligations, strategies, and psychological conditioning. Ambition became a familial mandate, ruthlessness a survival tool, and loyalty a currency more valuable than gold. Ultimately, the study of hidden marriages and secret alliances illuminates the invisible scaffolding behind history's most ruthless rulers. Power was rarely accidental, it was carefully constructed and preserved through networks that span generations. While public records might celebrate coronations, treaties, and conquests, it was these unseen arrangements, silent, deliberate, and often clandestine, that determined which dynasties endured and which faded into obscurity. By uncovering these hidden connections, we begin to see the true architecture of ambition, a structure designed to produce rulers who were not only powerful but primed for ruthlessness from birth. And as we move forward, the next chapter will take us into the intimate and often disturbing world of childhood within these dynasties, revealing how formative experiences inside palace walls cemented the traits necessary for tyranny. The cradle of a ruler's life is often shrouded in myth, stories of innocence, precocious intelligence, or predestined greatness. Yet, beneath these idealized narratives lies a far darker reality. For the heirs of history's most ruthless dynasties, childhood was rarely a sanctuary of play and learning. It was a carefully engineered environment, designed to mold obedience, cunning, and, above all, the capacity for cruelty. From the very earliest days, these young lives were immersed in a world where survival, power, and dominance were the primary lessons, and the comforts of ordinary childhood were luxuries few could afford. Across continents and centuries, a striking pattern emerges: the children of powerful families were systematically exposed to fear, competition, and hierarchical discipline. In European courts, young princes were often removed from the warmth of parental affection and placed under the strict supervision of tutors, guardians, and court officials. Their days were regimented with lessons in strategy, rhetoric, and history, but equally significant were the implicit teachings about hierarchy, loyalty, and punishment. Servants, siblings, and even peers became instruments in a constant exercise of control, testing patience, manipulating alliances, and observing reactions. Every minor failure was a potential lesson in humiliation or retribution, preparing the child for a world where mistakes could mean exile, imprisonment, or death. In the Ottoman Empire, the situation was even more severe. Princes, confined in isolated quarters for years, were educated in the mechanics of administration, diplomacy, and war, yet they were also made acutely aware of their vulnerability. The fear of fratricide, the expectation that brothers might be eliminated to secure succession, was instilled from a young age. This psychological conditioning created rulers who were both vigilant and calculating, where trust was scarce, and betrayal was anticipated even from those closest in blood. The children of these households learned early that emotional detachment was not only practical but essential for survival. East Asia presents similarly stark examples. In imperial China, the heirs of emperors were immersed in strict scholarly training alongside lessons in governance and philosophy. Confucian teachings emphasize duty, discipline, and moral rectitude, but alongside this moral framework were lessons in strategic thinking, secrecy, and sometimes ruthless enforcement of authority. Diaries and historical anecdotes reveal that children were often expected to witness and even participate in demonstrations of punishment, observing firsthand the consequences of disobedience or failure. In these early experiences, compassion was subordinated to strategy, empathy was secondary to pragmatism, and the seeds of calculated cruelty were quietly sown. Yet childhood cruelty was not always a formalized education. In many dynasties, it manifested in subtle, almost invisible ways. Siblings were pitted against each other in competition for favor and inheritance. Tutors tested both intellect and temperament, sometimes using fear as a pedagogical tool. Servants and minor courtiers were observed, manipulated, and occasionally punished to demonstrate power and control. Children internalized these lessons, learning to read deception, anticipate danger, and deploy influence, skills that would become essential in adulthood. These formative experiences were not anomalies, they were carefully cultivated aspects of dynastic strategy, designed to produce heirs capable of navigating, and ultimately dominating, the treacherous terrain of court politics. The psychological consequences of such a childhood were profound. Many rulers developed a heightened sense of paranoia, hypervigilance, or an emotional detachment that would later manifest in both their personal and political lives. Some became excessively controlling, seeing loyalty as transactional rather than emotional. Others internalized aggression, using fear as a primary tool of governance. Even rulers who exhibited moments of empathy or generosity often carried the subtle marks of these early lessons: a cautious distrust of others, a propensity for strategic cruelty, or a relentless drive for consolidation of power. Historical records, rare letters, diaries, and memoirs, offer glimpses into these shadowed upbringings. In some cases, they reveal children expressing curiosity about punishment, fascination with authority, or admiration for cunning behavior. In others, they hint at internalized anxiety, emotional suppression, and early signs of the cruelty they would later wield as adults. These documents, often overlooked by mainstream narratives, provide the most vivid evidence of how childhood functioned as both preparation and prefiguration for the ruthless rulers history would remember. Even seemingly small experiences could have outsized effects. A moment of favoritism by a parent, a carefully deployed punishment by a tutor, or a secretive instruction in political intrigue could shape attitudes toward power and loyalty for decades. The patterns of behavior instilled during these formative years often dictated not only how a ruler exercised authority but also how they perceived threats, opportunities, and the very nature of human relationships. In this way, childhood in dynastic households was both a mirror and a mold, a reflection of existing familial strategies and a mechanism for perpetuating them in the next generation. Understanding the dark side of childhood is essential for comprehending the full trajectory of ruthless rulers. It reveals that cruelty, ambition, and strategic cunning were not merely products of adult experience or historical circumstance, they were seeded early, nurtured through observation, fear, and subtle manipulation. This realization adds a human dimension to the otherwise mythic narratives of tyrants, showing us that even the most fearsome rulers were once children, learning the intricate lessons that would define their lives. As we move forward, the next chapter will explore the unseen figures who guided these children, the shadow advisors, clandestine tutors, and hidden influencers who amplified both inherited tendencies and learned behaviors, creating a perfect storm of ambition and ruthlessness that would shape history for generations. Even the most carefully cultivated heirs of dynasties rarely ascended the throne, or wielded their power alone. Behind every notorious ruler, there were figures whose influence was invisible to the public eye: advisors, mentors, confidants, and manipulators who operated in the shadows, shaping decisions, molding personalities, and guiding ambition with subtle, often ruthless precision. These unseen forces were as critical to the formation of power as bloodline or education, and in many cases, their impact would resonate far beyond the palace walls, quietly steering the course of history. From the earliest civilizations to modern monarchies, shadow advisors occupied a unique space in the corridors of power. They were the custodians of knowledge, the keepers of secrets, and the interpreters of both threats and opportunities. In medieval Europe, young princes were often assigned tutors who doubled as political guides, exposing their charges not only to classical education but also to the intricate realities of court intrigue. These advisors were themselves products of experience and ambition. They understood the stakes, the dangers of inexperience, and the need to cultivate both intelligence and cunning in their pupils. Through careful guidance, and sometimes calculated manipulation, they shaped heirs into leaders who could navigate treachery with poise, or, when necessary, respond with ruthless precision. The Ottomans provide a vivid example of this dynamic. In the confined, intensely competitive world of the imperial harem and palace, princes relied on a web of advisors, including eunuchs, military tutors, and political operatives, to navigate the labyrinth of succession and power. These figures were often invisible to the broader court but wielded extraordinary influence over the young heirs. They taught lessons in loyalty, deception, and strategic patience, instilling a mindset in which preemptive action and calculated cruelty were not just acceptable, but essential. Some of these mentors acted as moral guides, others as manipulators, but all shared a singular goal: to prepare the heir to survive, and dominate, in a world where the wrong decision could mean death. In East Asia, shadow advisors were equally vital, though their methods differed according to cultural and philosophical frameworks. In imperial China, Confucian scholars and senior officials often played dual roles. They were educators who imparted knowledge of governance, ritual, and morality, yet they were also observers and evaluators of the young heir's temperament. A single misstep, a failure to adhere to protocol, a display of impatience, or an inability to suppress emotion, could trigger careful correction or subtle humiliation. These hidden interventions shaped not only the ruler's knowledge but also the emotional and psychological resilience required to maintain absolute authority. The child learned to anticipate counsel, to weigh advice against instinct, and ultimately to distinguish between loyalty and manipulation, a skill crucial for survival in adulthood. The influence of these shadow figures extended beyond the immediate lessons they imparted. In many cases, they served as intermediaries between the heir and the complex web of familial and political networks that surrounded them. They monitored interactions with siblings, parents, and distant relatives, subtly orchestrating relationships to strengthen alliances, provoke rivalry, or cultivate ambition. Through these invisible hands, children internalized not only the mechanics of power but also the very ethics, or lack thereof, that would guide their rule. Observation became instruction, fear became strategy, loyalty became a tool rather than a virtue. Even in European courts, where chroniclers often portrayed rulers as independent and decisive from an early age, the unseen influence of mentors and advisors was profound. Tutors often acted as gatekeepers, controlling access to information, shaping opinions, and instilling ideologies that would later manifest in policy decisions. Some tutors encouraged cruelty as a demonstration of strength, others promoted strategic ruthlessness as a means of survival. Letters, memoirs, and rare accounts from court insiders reveal that the guidance of these advisors was sometimes more formative than the lessons taught by parents or siblings. In essence, the future rulers' worldview, their conception of power, loyalty, and morality, was as much a product of these hidden relationships as of inherited ambition or childhood conditioning. The cumulative effect of these shadow influences was striking. By the time heirs ascended to power, many were already highly trained in the art of manipulation, diplomacy, and, when necessary, calculated brutality. They were attuned to the subtle currents of loyalty and deception within their courts, capable of reading motives with precision and responding with both strategic patience and swift action. Some of the most infamous rulers in history, those whose names became synonymous with fear, were not merely products of bloodline or environment, they were meticulously sculpted through years of invisible mentorship and covert guidance. Yet the influence of these figures was not always benevolent. While some mentors sought to produce wise and capable rulers, others exploited their positions to manipulate succession, advance personal ambitions, or settle old grudges. In these cases, the young heir absorbed lessons in mistrust, paranoia, and strategic cruelty not from necessity alone but also from deliberate manipulation. The palace became a classroom not only for governance but also for the harsh realities of human ambition, with the child ruler at once student and subject. By examining these unseen advisors and shadow influences, we begin to see the full architecture of dynastic power. Rulers were rarely autonomous from the very beginning, their ambitions, strategies, and even moral frameworks were shaped by the silent hands that guided them through the labyrinth of childhood, adolescence, and early adulthood. These figures, largely invisible in historical narratives, left indelible marks on the psyche and policies of the rulers they molded. Understanding their role allows us to appreciate the complexity behind cruelty and ambition, revealing that the acts of history's most feared leaders were often the culmination not of individual choice alone, but of generations of instruction, observation, and subtle orchestration. As we move into the next chapter, we will explore the intersection of biology and dynasty, the ways in which inherited traits and physiological predispositions intersected with upbringing and mentorship, creating rulers whose ambition and ruthlessness seemed almost predestined. While mentors, tutors, and shadow advisors shaped the minds of young heirs, another, less visible force quietly influenced the making of history's most ruthless rulers: biology. The interplay between heredity, genetics, and physiology often reinforced traits that were further cultivated by upbringing and environment. In many ways, dynastic power was not only learned, it was inherited, encoded in the very blood that coursed through the veins of these rulers. By exploring the biological dimension of leadership, we uncover a layer of influence that is as fascinating as it is unsettling, revealing how physical and mental predispositions intersected with ambition and cruelty. Historical genealogies frequently show patterns of behavior and temperament recurring across generations. Families that produced multiple ambitious or ruthless rulers often did so not by chance, but as a consequence of inherited traits. Aggression, strategic thinking, risk tolerance, and even certain impulsive tendencies appear with striking regularity. For instance, the Habsburgs' long history of complex familial intermarriages preserved not only political alliances but also hereditary characteristics, some beneficial, others detrimental. In these cases, the bloodline itself functioned as a conduit, transmitting qualities that predisposed individuals to dominance, vigilance, or, in some instances, cruelty. Modern genetics suggests that traits such as impulsivity, social dominance, and even empathy, or lack thereof, can have hereditary components, offering a lens through which we can examine historical patterns of behavior. Medical history, too, provides insight into how physiology may have shaped rulership. Some dynasties were plagued, or, in some ways, enhanced, by hereditary conditions that influenced temperament and decision-making. Hyperaggression, anxiety disorders, or neurological sensitivities, though poorly understood in their time, likely interacted with the pressures of court life to produce rulers both brilliant and terrifying. The physical health of rulers also played a crucial role. Chronic illness, disabilities, or extreme physical vigor could dictate the kinds of actions a ruler took, their resilience under stress, and their relationship with fear and authority. In short, biology set the stage on which ambition and environment performed their intricate dance. Even more intriguing is the intersection of genetics and psychology in explaining strategic cruelty. Consider the potential influence of inherited temperament. A ruler predisposed to heightened vigilance or low tolerance for uncertainty may have been more inclined to enforce harsh discipline or suppress dissent swiftly. Similarly, inherited intelligence, combined with exposure to political intrigue, could produce a leader capable of extraordinary planning, and, at times, devastating calculation. In dynastic households, these inherited tendencies were amplified. Children born into these environments were simultaneously equipped with natural abilities and trained to exploit them fully. The result was a generation of leaders who seemed almost predestined for authority and, occasionally, tyranny. The physical environment and lifestyle of dynastic heirs further interacted with biology. Nutrition, disease, and stress during early development could influence cognitive and emotional growth, shaping temperament in ways that complemented inherited traits. For example, children subjected to strict diets, physical training, or isolation often developed heightened focus, resilience, and, in some cases, psychological detachment, all traits that would serve them in positions of extreme authority. In combination with inherited predispositions, these conditions created a subtle but powerful matrix that molded behavior long before a ruler assumed power. Historical evidence suggests that rulers often internalized these biological and physiological traits without conscious awareness. Personal diaries, letters, and contemporaneous accounts reveal individuals noting their own tendencies toward impatience, suspicion, or decisiveness, often without understanding their origins. In dynastic households, these traits were observed and sometimes deliberately reinforced by tutors and advisors. A naturally vigilant heir might be encouraged to exploit that vigilance, a quick-tempered child trained to channel anger into calculated action. The convergence of heredity and deliberate cultivation created rulers whose personalities and behaviors were remarkably consistent across generations. Biology also sheds light on the darker aspects of leadership, particularly cruelty. Certain inherited tendencies, when combined with environmental reinforcement, may have predisposed individuals to use fear as a tool of control. Neurological research today suggests that variations in stress response, impulse control, and reward perception can influence aggressive or domineering behavior. Applied to historical rulers, these predispositions, coupled with early exposure to hierarchical dominance and political intrigue, may explain the emergence of cruelty not merely as a personal choice but as an adaptive strategy encoded both in blood and nurtured by circumstance. Ultimately, understanding the biological dimension of rulership adds nuance to our view of history. It reveals that ambition, cruelty, and strategic acumen were not merely products of environment or mentorship, they were also inherited, shaped by traits passed down through generations and amplified by training and circumstance. Bloodlines carried more than names and titles, they transmitted potential, vulnerabilities, and tendencies that, when combined with careful cultivation, could produce some of the most formidable rulers in history. By acknowledging the scientific underpinnings of power, we gain a fuller understanding of the intersection between heredity and history. These rulers were not simply products of their ambition or circumstance, they were the culmination of generations of biological preparation, psychological molding, and strategic cultivation. And as we turn to the next chapter, we will step inside the private lives of these dynasties, exploring the intimate, often shocking realities of everyday life that reinforce these inherited tendencies and secret teachings, shaping rulers in ways both visible and unseen. While heredity, mentorship, and shadow advisors laid the intellectual and psychological groundwork for ruthless rulers. The day-to-day realities of palace life played an equally critical role in shaping character. The private routines, rituals, and hierarchies of dynastic households were anything but ordinary. Behind the grand facades of castles, palaces, and imperial courts, life was a constant exercise in strategy, obedience, and control, a daily rehearsal for power that left deep imprints on those who would one day command entire nations. In European courts, for example, young heirs were immersed in meticulously organized daily schedules that balanced education, etiquette, and observation of authority. Every aspect of life was designed to reinforce hierarchy and to instill a subtle understanding of the dynamics of power. Mealtime could be a demonstration of status: who sat where, who was served first, and how servants were treated became daily lessons in protocol and authority. Even seemingly trivial interactions offered opportunities to practice control, anticipate threats, or manipulate outcomes. In these households, children learned that influence was earned as much through observation and subtle maneuvering as through formal education. The psychological dimensions of daily life were no less profound. Servants, siblings, and even playmates were often drawn into the subtle games of power that unfolded within palace walls. Young heirs observed the rewards and punishments meted out to those around them, learning which behaviors were rewarded, which were punished, and, perhaps most importantly, how fear could be wielded as a tool of control. These interactions created an environment where empathy was frequently subordinated to strategy, where kindness could be exploited, and where cruelty became normalized. In this sense, everyday life was itself a rigorous training ground, producing rulers whose understanding of human behavior was both acute and often merciless. In the Ottoman palace, life followed a similarly structured, if more intensely secretive, pattern. Princes and princesses were confined within tightly controlled quarters, where every encounter, every lesson, and every observation was part of a larger curriculum in power. Children witnessed the complexities of court politics firsthand, often observing rivalries, manipulations, and clandestine negotiations. They learned to read expressions, interpret intention, and anticipate betrayal, skills as essential for personal survival as for the future administration of an empire. The palace became a microcosm of the wider political world, a stage where the interplay of loyalty, fear, and strategy was rehearsed daily, long before heirs ever assumed their formal roles. Even in East Asia, where moral and philosophical instruction was central to upbringing, the rhythm of daily life reinforced hierarchy and discipline. Imperial children observed and participated in rituals, ceremonies, and administrative routines that emphasized order, obedience, and calculated conduct. Their interactions with elders, officials, and peers were carefully monitored, teaching them to navigate complex social hierarchies with precision. Minor acts of defiance or inattention could be met with strict correction, reinforcing the understanding that personal will was always subordinate to duty, expectation, and strategy. In this environment, lessons in governance were inseparable from lessons in control and influence. Daily life in these households also included moments of subtle psychological conditioning. Tutors might stage exercises in loyalty or deception, pitting siblings against one another or placing children in morally complex situations to test judgment. Servants could be made to act out scenarios of betrayal or obedience, giving young heirs first-hand experience of human vulnerability and ambition. Even leisure activities, such as games or sports, were often framed as exercises in strategy, competition, and dominance. Every routine, every interaction, became a building block in the formation of a ruler capable of both extraordinary insight and calculated ruthlessness. Luxury and privilege added another layer of complexity. While the material comforts of dynastic life might suggest indulgence or frivolity, they also carried implicit lessons in power and entitlement. Children learned early that wealth was both a tool and a weapon, capable of influencing loyalty and inspiring fear. The management of estates, allocation of resources, and distribution of favors became subtle lessons in governance and control. Every aspect of everyday life, comforts, obligations, and constraints alike, reinforced the intricate architecture of power. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of these daily routines was the normalization of fear and discipline as constants in life. Observing punishments, witnessing rivalries, or noting the consequences of disobedience taught young heirs that the world was a place where power was contested and survival required vigilance. These seemingly ordinary moments, meals, lessons, play, chores, were, in fact, instruments in the cultivation of rulers who could navigate complexity, exploit weakness, and enforce authority with precision. Everyday life in these households was a crucible, shaping personality, judgment, and moral perspective in ways that were almost invisible to outsiders. Understanding the role of daily life illuminates a critical truth: the private environment of dynastic households was as influential as the public and political education of rulers. The patterns established in these early years, through observation, routine, and subtle conditioning, produced heirs who were psychologically equipped for governance, often at the cost of empathy, innocence, or moral restraint. By embedding lessons in loyalty, strategy, and control into the very rhythm of daily life, dynasties ensured that their heirs emerged not only knowledgeable but psychologically hardened, capable of exercising power with an unflinching and often ruthless precision. As we move forward, the next chapter will explore how history has remembered, or misremembered, these dynasties. We will examine the narratives, myths, and reinterpretations that have shaped our understanding of these rulers, revealing the tension between the public image of greatness and the hidden realities of cruelty, secrecy, and calculated influence that underpinned their lives. While dynasties carefully engineered ambition, cruelty, and power behind closed doors, the way history remembers, or misremembers, their rulers is often just as revealing as the rulers themselves. The public narratives that reach us today are not neutral accounts, they are the product of propaganda, political agendas, selective chronicling, and myth-making. Kings, emperors, and sultans who were once children learning fear, strategy, and manipulation behind palace walls are often portrayed in textbooks and media as either heroic visionaries or monstrous villains. Yet between these extremes lies a far more complex truth, shaped by hidden bloodlines, untold alliances, and the subtle, often invisible forces that governed their upbringing. Historical records themselves were rarely objective. Chroniclers, historians, and scribes often wrote under the patronage of the very rulers they described, or under their successors, meaning that narratives were carefully curated to emphasize legitimacy, divine favor, or grandeur. Acts of cruelty were sometimes downplayed or sanitized, moments of cunning and political maneuvering were often reframed as brilliance rather than strategic ruthlessness. Conversely, the same sources could exaggerate transgressions or misdeeds to discredit rivals, obscure inconvenient alliances, or justify coups and conquests. In many cases, the bloodline, the secret thread connecting ruler to ruler, remained invisible, leaving only isolated acts to define the narrative, stripped of context and continuity. The creation of myth extended beyond written accounts. Portraits, architecture, and ceremonial rituals were used to project an image of power and stability, carefully masking the complexities of daily life and personal development. A monarch's lavish palace or commanding portrait was more than aesthetics, it was a statement, a carefully constructed illusion designed to impress, intimidate, and solidify legitimacy. The public consumed these symbols without insight into the psychological, biological, and familial factors that shaped the ruler's character. Behind the grandeur lay calculated cruelty, learned cunning, and the invisible influence of tutors, advisors, and secretive family networks. The myth of greatness often concealed the machinery that produced it. Modern reinterpretations have only added layers to this narrative. Popular media frequently dramatizes rulers as either innately evil or genius strategists, overlooking the subtle interplay of inherited traits, early conditioning, and unseen mentorship. Rarely do documentaries, novels, or films explore the cumulative effects of childhood environments, shadow advisors, and secret alliances in shaping leadership. Even historians, bound by fragmentary evidence, have sometimes focused on the most sensational episodes, assassinations, wars, betrayals, without tracing their origins in hidden family dynamics or dynastic preparation. This selective storytelling perpetuates a mythos that emphasizes outcome over causation, obscuring the deliberate, generational architecture behind power. Yet the mythos is not entirely misleading. It preserves kernels of truth, albeit often distorted or amplified. Some rulers did indeed display extraordinary cruelty or brilliance that seemed to emerge spontaneously, and the public's fascination with these traits has contributed to the enduring allure of dynasties. But closer examination reveals a more nuanced reality. These traits were rarely accidental, nor purely the product of individual temperament. They were cultivated through the intersection of bloodline, upbringing, environment, and mentorship, a complex ecosystem largely invisible to the chroniclers who recorded only fragments. The tension between reality and myth is particularly evident when examining lesser-known figures in royal bloodlines. Many heirs who were trained, tested, and prepared for leadership never ascended to power, and their stories were often erased or forgotten. In some cases, they perished in political intrigue or were deliberately sidelined to preserve the image of a particular ruler. The historical record, therefore, is selective, emphasizing certain traits and events while leaving others in obscurity. These omissions create the illusion of spontaneity, the impression that a ruler's cruelty, cunning, or genius was innate, rather than the product of a carefully engineered process spanning generations. Rare documents, recently discovered letters, and overlooked diaries offer glimpses into the truth behind the myth. They reveal how families carefully groomed heirs, orchestrated secret alliances, and deployed tutors and advisors to cultivate desired traits. They document moments of manipulation, psychological conditioning, and deliberate exposure to power dynamics that would later shape behavior. When pieced together, these fragments challenge the simplified narratives that dominate history books and popular media, showing that behind every celebrated, or vilified, ruler lies an intricate web of hidden influences. Recognizing this hidden framework transforms our understanding of history. It encourages us to view dynasties not merely as collections of individuals but as interconnected networks in which inherited traits, environmental pressures, mentorship, and strategy combine to produce rulers capable of extraordinary action. The myths, while compelling, are incomplete. They reveal the surface of power while concealing its deep architecture. By exploring the bloodline, the hidden alliances, and the unseen shaping forces, we gain a more accurate and strikingly human perspective on rulers whose reputations have often been reduced to caricature. Ultimately, rewriting the bloodline mythos is an exercise in restoring context and depth. It shows us that history's ruthless rulers were not anomalies, nor were they simply products of personal choice. They were the culmination of generations of preparation, carefully orchestrated learning, and secretive influence, all operating in parallel with inherited traits and environmental pressures. By unveiling the hidden truth behind myth, we can finally understand the complex dynamics that created some of the most fearsome figures in history, revealing both the extraordinary and the profoundly human forces that shaped their lives. While the internal dynamics of dynasties, bloodline, upbringing, and hidden mentorship shaped individual rulers, their influence often extended far beyond their palaces, kingdoms, or empires. History reveals a complex web in which secretive bloodlines transcended borders, linking regions, nations, and even continents in networks of ambition, alliance, and, at times, tyranny. The hidden connections forged by marriages, diplomacy, and strategic familial planning shaped the political, cultural, and military landscapes of entire regions, demonstrating that the power of ruthless dynasties was rarely confined to a single throne. Europe offers one of the clearest examples of this phenomenon. The Habsburgs, perhaps the most famous illustration of dynastic networking, used intermarriage to extend their influence across the continent. Through a series of carefully orchestrated unions, they connected the thrones of Spain, Austria, Hungary, and Bohemia, creating an empire bound less by military conquest than by blood and strategic alliances. These marriages were rarely romantic. They were tools of power, designed to secure loyalty, expand influence, and consolidate wealth. The resulting web of relations meant that conflicts, inheritances, and even wars were dictated as much by family connections as by politics or ideology. Bloodlines, in essence, became a form of soft power, capable of shaping continental affairs without the overt use of armies. In the Ottoman Empire, cross-border influence was also deeply tied to dynastic strategy. Princes and princesses married into families from neighboring regions, forging connections that strengthened political alliances, secured trade routes, or neutralized potential rivals. While the public often saw only a single ruler's decisions or campaigns, these marriages created a network of influence that allowed the dynasty to exercise power indirectly, shaping regional dynamics through loyalty, obligation, and familial pressure. The heirs of such unions were trained not only to govern their immediate realms but also to act as nodes in a larger network of control, linking distant territories to the central authority of the dynasty. East Asia demonstrates similar patterns, though often couched in different cultural and philosophical frameworks. Imperial China's ruling families frequently forged marriages with powerful clans, ensuring that political loyalty extended across vast regions. These alliances were as much about preserving social order as they were about strengthening dynastic reach. Korea, Japan, and other neighboring states sometimes participated in similar arrangements, creating transnational connections that were subtle but deeply influential. Children born into these unions inherited not only wealth and status but also the responsibilities and expectations of navigating a complex, interconnected political landscape, a landscape shaped by unseen bloodline networks as much as by formal government structures. These global connections had tangible consequences. Wars were fought and peace treaties signed with family ties as much in mind as territorial ambition. Succession disputes in one kingdom could ripple across continents, as distant relatives invoked claims, alliances, or debts inherited through decades of intermarriage. Diplomacy was a delicate balance of obligation, rivalry, and strategy, with bloodlines serving as both leverage and constraint. In some cases, rulers who appeared to act independently were in fact following invisible pressures imposed by these sprawling dynastic networks, their decisions informed as much by inherited obligation as by personal ambition. The ripple effects of these global bloodline connections also extended to economics, culture, and intellectual life. Dynastic marriages often facilitated trade agreements, promoted artistic exchange, and even influenced the spread of religious or philosophical ideas. Monarchs could leverage family ties to gain access to resources, advisors, and military support that would have been impossible to secure through conventional diplomacy alone. Conversely, dynastic conflicts and rivalries could destabilize entire regions, demonstrating that the reach of bloodlines was as much a source of vulnerability as it was of power. In this way, the private strategies of dynasties left public and global consequences, reshaping the political map in ways that persisted for generations. The psychological and strategic dimensions of these global connections are equally striking. Rulers educated in the subtle art of alliance, negotiation, and deception often internalized a worldview in which family, loyalty, and obligation were inseparable from power itself. Their decisions were informed not only by immediate political considerations but also by centuries of accumulated precedent, strategic foresight, and inherited expectation. The ambitions of a single ruler were rarely isolated, they were extensions of a dynastic vision, crafted over generations and reinforced through secretive networks that spanned borders and time. By examining the global influence of dynastic bloodlines, we see that the scope of power was far greater than any individual reign. These rulers were both products and agents of a vast system, one in which ambition, cruelty, and strategy were propagated across continents. The private mechanisms of family and mentorship, when multiplied and extended through marriage and alliance, shaped the trajectory of empires, kingdoms, and entire regions. Hidden bloodlines became the connective tissue of history, linking seemingly disparate events, conflicts, and leaders into a coherent, though often invisible, pattern of influence. Ultimately, the global reach of these dynasties underscores the magnitude of their impact. Power was not merely exercised through armies, decrees, or conquest, it was inherited, cultivated, and strategically extended across borders, weaving a web that influenced the course of nations. Understanding this hidden architecture allows us to appreciate not only the ruthlessness and ambition of individual rulers but also the profound, often unseen, ways in which family, strategy, and bloodlines shaped world history. While dynasties carefully cultivated heirs and extended influence across borders, much of the darker side of their power remained deliberately concealed from the historical record. Behind the grandeur of thrones and the glitter of coronations lay a shadowy world of crimes, betrayals, and atrocities that were often hidden from public view, obscured by propaganda, or sanitized by subsequent chroniclers. These hidden crimes, ranging from political assassinations and orchestrated purges to coercion, forced marriages, and exploitation, played a critical role in securing and sustaining dynastic power. Yet, they also left legacies that resonate long after the rulers themselves disappeared from history. Throughout history, the most notorious rulers often relied on secrecy and deception to maintain authority. In European courts, assassinations of rivals, sometimes family members, were quietly executed, leaving little record but rumor and subtle historical hints. Letters, diaries, and marginalia provide rare glimpses into these hidden machinations, revealing careful orchestration behind acts that would later be described as inevitable or unavoidable by official chroniclers. The elimination of rivals was rarely random, it was a calculated strategy to secure succession, consolidate wealth, and protect dynastic continuity. In many cases, these actions, though cruel, were framed by contemporaries as necessary, justified by loyalty, religion, or the preservation of stability. What remained hidden, however, was the human cost, the fear, manipulation, and moral compromises imposed upon those both targeted and complicit. The Ottoman Empire offers a striking illustration of hidden crimes executed under the guise of governance. The practice of fratricide, for example, was a deliberate strategy to prevent succession disputes, preserve central authority, and eliminate potential rebellion. While publicly justified as a harsh but necessary measure to maintain order, these acts left deep psychological scars on surviving heirs, embedding a culture of fear, vigilance, and ruthless pragmatism. Behind palace walls, the executioner's work was as deliberate as it was hidden, reinforcing lessons learned during childhood and amplifying the influence of mentors and advisors who guided heirs in the art of strategic cruelty. Such practices, while often sanitized in historical records, reveal a deliberate and sustained use of fear as a tool of governance, a dark legacy transmitted across generations. In East Asia, dynasties similarly concealed acts of coercion and elimination. Imperial succession, political purges, and forced compliance were often executed with meticulous planning, leaving only the faintest traces in official chronicles. Advisors and court officials frequently acted as intermediaries, orchestrating eliminations or exiles in ways that insulated the ruler from direct culpability. Even seemingly minor acts of control, such as the forced placement of heirs under strict observation, the manipulation of family alliances, or the use of secrecy in rituals, contributed to a broader system of psychological conditioning and societal control. Over time, these hidden practices shaped not only the behavior of rulers but also the expectations and obedience of entire populations, embedding dynastic power within social, cultural, and political structures. The hidden crimes of dynasties were not limited to political maneuvers or palace intrigue. Economic exploitation, coerced labor, and the imposition of harsh policies on populations were frequently carried out under the authority of rulers whose personal lives were carefully controlled by inherited expectations, mentorship, and alliances. These acts, often framed as necessary for the stability or prosperity of the realm, produced lasting consequences for ordinary citizens, whose experiences were rarely recorded. Historical documents, archaeological evidence, and rare personal accounts occasionally reveal these realities, offering a glimpse into the human cost of dynastic power. The tension between public celebration and private atrocity underscores the duality of these rulers' legacies, publicly lauded for achievement, privately responsible for suffering. Psychologically, hidden crimes also left indelible marks on rulers themselves. The constant engagement with secrecy, manipulation, and moral compromise contributed to patterns of paranoia, detachment, and strategic cruelty. Rulers who executed, or sanctioned, hidden crimes often became both feared and isolated, developing worldviews shaped by the necessity of dominance and the pervasiveness of betrayal. The cycles of observation, fear, and control that began in childhood were reinforced through adult actions, producing leaders whose capacity for cruelty was both learned and deliberate. These behaviors, embedded in personal and dynastic psychology, created feedback loops that perpetuated secrecy and ruthlessness across generations. The legacies of these hidden crimes extend beyond the lifespan of individual rulers. Policies forged through coercion or fear, the elimination of rivals, and strategic manipulation of bloodlines produced long-term consequences for succession, governance, and societal structures. Dynasties that successfully navigated these hidden mechanisms maintained power for generations, while those that faltered often left chaos, rebellion, or fragmentation in their wake. The psychological imprint of hidden crimes, on both rulers and subjects, shaped the ethical and political landscape of entire regions, demonstrating that the unseen dimensions of power are often as consequential as the visible ones. Even today, the uncovering of these hidden crimes continues to reshape our understanding of history. Newly discovered letters, court records, and archaeological evidence reveal patterns of manipulation, brutality, and coercion that were long obscured. These revelations challenge sanitized historical narratives, forcing a reassessment of what it means to inherit power, exercise authority, and leave a legacy. They remind us that history is not simply a record of triumphs and defeats but a complex interplay of ambition, strategy, morality, and secrecy, a narrative in which the hidden actions of rulers were as influential as their public deeds. By examining the hidden crimes and dark legacies of dynasties, we gain a more nuanced understanding of history's most notorious rulers. Their actions were rarely isolated, they were the culmination of inherited ambition, rigorous training, secret mentorship, and strategic alliances, all amplified by biological predispositions and reinforced through everyday experiences. These rulers were both products and producers of an environment where secrecy, cruelty, and manipulation were not only normalized but necessary for survival. In this light, the study of hidden crimes becomes more than a catalogue of atrocities, it is a window into the architecture of power itself, revealing the hidden forces that shaped rulers, dynasties, and the course of human history. While the chronicles of history often focus on wars, succession crises, and the calculated ruthlessness of rulers, the more peculiar and lesser-known facets of dynastic life are equally revealing. Behind the official records, hidden bloodlines, and meticulously curated public images, there existed a world of eccentricity, strange rituals, and bizarre personal habits that offer insight into the minds of rulers and the cultures that produced them. These oddities, often overlooked by mainstream narratives, reveal how idiosyncrasies, superstitions, and peculiar behaviors intersected with ambition, power, and cruelty, shaping the contours of history in unexpected ways. Many rulers, for example, developed unusual obsessions that reflected their inner psychology and the pressures of dynastic life. Some hoarded objects as symbols of authority or superstition, surrounding themselves with talismans, rare artifacts, or even preserved animal parts believed to confer protection or wisdom. Others engaged in obsessive cataloging, whether of people, lands, or inventories, transforming administrative diligence into a compulsive need to control every detail of their world. These behaviors, while often dismissed as eccentricity, reveal the deep psychological imprint of upbringing, mentorship, and the constant pressure to maintain control. They offer a window into how personal quirks could intersect with governance, producing both effective rulers and erratic, sometimes terrifying leaders. Hidden rituals, often passed down through bloodlines, also played a role in reinforcing authority and shaping behavior. Certain dynasties practiced secret ceremonies intended to cultivate loyalty, test obedience, or prepare heirs for the burdens of leadership. These rituals ranged from elaborate coming-of-age trials to symbolic acts of dominance or submission, each designed to imprint lessons of hierarchy, vigilance, and strategic thinking. Rare accounts suggest that some rituals involved staged scenarios in which children witnessed acts of punishment, deception, or manipulation, providing an early education in both cruelty and the subtle dynamics of power. The psychological impact of these ceremonies was profound, embedding lessons in authority that would shape behavior for a lifetime. Odd and sometimes macabre personal habits also reflected the intersection of biology, upbringing, and psychological conditioning. Some rulers exhibited extreme dietary preferences, sleep patterns, or physical routines, often justified as necessary for mental acuity, spiritual preparation, or physical vigor. Others surrounded themselves with individuals chosen not for companionship but as objects of observation, testing loyalty, intelligence, or emotional resilience. In many cases, these behaviors were tolerated or even encouraged by tutors and advisors, who recognized their potential to cultivate traits beneficial to rulership: vigilance, control, calculation, and strategic detachment. The line between eccentricity and deliberate preparation for power was often blurred, leaving observers both fascinated and unnerved. The personal relationships of rulers were likewise infused with peculiar patterns. Marriages, alliances, and even friendships could serve dual purposes. Publicly, they presented an image of propriety or diplomacy; privately, they reinforced secret networks of influence, loyalty, and surveillance. Children, siblings, and advisors often became instruments in subtle games of control and observation. Some rulers fostered relationships that were outwardly affectionate but strategically manipulative, using intimacy to reinforce loyalty or assess character. The intertwining of the personal and political in these unusual dynamics demonstrates how hidden bloodlines and the architecture of upbringing extended beyond formal governance into the intimate spaces of daily life. History is also rich with anecdotes that highlight the intersection of oddity and ambition. Some rulers conducted experiments in social behavior, observing reactions to arbitrary rules or punishments; others displayed obsessive attention to appearances, rituals, or ceremonial precision, using them as tools to project power and intimidate rivals. Even trivial-seeming idiosyncrasies could carry political significance. A ruler's unusual tolerance for certain behaviors or insistence on specific protocols might influence court dynamics, succession disputes, or diplomatic relations. These stories, often relegated to footnotes in history books, provide insight into the daily realities of dynastic life, revealing how hidden traits, eccentric habits, and subtle lessons combine to shape leadership. What makes these lesser-known stories particularly compelling is the way they illuminate the human dimension of rulers often portrayed as larger-than-life figures. They reveal the intersection of inherited traits, upbringing, mentorship, and personal idiosyncrasy, showing that ambition and cruelty were not abstract qualities but lived experiences, shaped by psychology, environment, and circumstance. Even seemingly trivial behaviors, hoarding, obsessive cataloging, unusual rituals, contributed to the formation of rulers capable of extraordinary foresight, strategic ruthlessness, and occasionally, unflinching cruelty. By exploring these weird facts and lesser-known stories, we gain a more textured understanding of history's most ruthless rulers. Their lives were not only shaped by bloodlines, mentorship, and political strategy but also by the peculiarities, obsessions, and rituals that humanized and sometimes distorted their personalities. These hidden layers remind us that history is not a simple record of power or cruelty but a complex tapestry in which biology, psychology, environment, and eccentricity intersect. Understanding the strange and surprising elements of dynastic life helps us appreciate the full spectrum of forces that produced some of the most formidable, terrifying, and fascinating figures in history. As we move to the conclusion, we will weave together these threads: bloodline, upbringing, mentorship, biology, everyday life, hidden crimes, and peculiarities, to leave viewers with a profound understanding of the hidden architecture of power, the human forces behind ambition, and the enduring legacies of history's most ruthless rulers. As we conclude this journey through the hidden corridors of power, it becomes clear that history's most ruthless rulers were never born in isolation. Their ambition, cunning, and, at times, cruelty were not accidents of character or momentary lapses of morality; they were the culmination of a complex, multi-layered system spanning generations. From bloodlines carefully cultivated through secret alliances to childhoods meticulously structured to instill vigilance and strategy, from shadow advisors who shaped perception and decision-making to inherited biological predispositions, the architecture of power was as deliberate as it was invisible. By tracing these hidden threads, we gain not only insight into individual rulers but also a deeper understanding of how dynasties, and history itself, were shaped. The study of hidden bloodlines illuminates a truth often obscured by myth and legend: power is rarely a matter of circumstance alone. It is engineered, nurtured, and maintained through a combination of heredity, mentorship, and subtle environmental conditioning. Rulers who seemed larger than life were, in fact, products of deliberate cultivation, both psychological and physical. Their successes, failures, and excesses cannot be fully understood without acknowledging the invisible influences that shaped their lives. From the private lessons learned in childhood to the clandestine networks of alliances that spanned borders, each factor contributed to a carefully orchestrated continuum of ambition, strategy, and, in some cases, ruthlessness. Yet perhaps the most striking insight comes from the human dimension of these rulers. Behind every act of cruelty or brilliance lies a story of upbringing, observation, and environmental shaping. The seemingly innate traits of vigilance, calculation, and detachment were often forged through fear, mentorship, and experience. Even eccentricities, rituals, and obsessive habits, those strange footnotes in history, played functional roles in shaping behavior and reinforcing power. What might appear to modern eyes as bizarre or extreme was, in the context of dynastic life, a form of adaptation, a strategy for survival and dominance within the rigid hierarchies of palace, court, and empire. The consequences of these hidden dynamics extend far beyond the personal sphere. Dynastic bloodlines influenced wars, diplomacy, economic networks, and cultural exchange across regions and continents. The marriages, alliances, and strategic relationships that connected rulers shaped not only political outcomes but also societal norms, trade patterns, and cultural developments. In this way, the private engineering of ambition and ruthlessness had public ramifications that echo through history. The hidden architecture of power was simultaneously intimate and global, personal and political, shaping both the lives of rulers and the trajectories of nations. Equally important is the tension between myth and reality. Public narratives often obscure the deliberate processes behind power, leaving us with simplified stories of genius, cruelty, or divine right. But as we have seen, these narratives are incomplete. Behind every coronation, victory, or scandal lies a deeper story of bloodlines, hidden alliances, secret mentorship, and carefully cultivated behavior. Recognizing this duality allows us to move beyond surface-level interpretations of history and appreciate the intricate, often invisible mechanisms that produced enduring legacies. Finally, the study of hidden bloodlines challenges us to consider the enduring relevance of these lessons. While the specific circumstances of dynastic Europe, the Ottoman Empire, or Imperial East Asia may seem distant, the underlying dynamics, inheritance, mentorship, environmental shaping, and the subtle exertion of influence, resonate in leadership, power structures, and human behavior today. Understanding the deliberate construction of ambition and ruthlessness offers insight not only into history but also into contemporary systems of influence, hierarchy, and decision-making. In the end, the story of history's most ruthless rulers is not merely a tale of cruelty or conquest, it is a story of deliberate design. Bloodlines, childhoods, shadow advisors, inherited traits, everyday routines, hidden crimes, and even peculiar habits all converge to shape individuals capable of extraordinary action. Their legacies, both visible and hidden, remind us that power is never random. It is the product of architecture, strategy, and environment, a structure built over generations and reinforced in ways both overt and unseen. By tracing these hidden threads, we come to understand rulers not only as figures of myth or legend but as profoundly human actors shaped by circumstance, strategy, and inheritance. We see the architecture of ambition, the machinery of ruthlessness, and the enduring shadow of bloodlines that continues to shape history in ways both subtle and profound. The lives of these rulers, their triumphs, failures, and peculiarities, leave a lasting impression. History is not simply what happens in public, but also what is carefully constructed, hidden, and passed down through generations, shaping the world in ways most of us rarely see. In examining the hidden bloodlines of history's most ruthless rulers, we uncover a world where ambition is engineered, power is inherited, and cruelty is often a product of preparation. And in doing so, we gain a fuller, more human understanding of history, a history in which the invisible forces of family, mentorship, biology, and secrecy are as powerful, enduring, and consequential as the acts of kings and emperors themselves.